They may not have appreciated the figure of repetition, or they felt that the figure wasn't as important as the flow of the language, so let's change the wording a little bit here. Which, in case they did not allow the English reader then to see the power of the repetition figure that's involved there. Okay? Here's another example we've already mentioned. Obadiah, right? I mentioned that three times deal here. And here's more of an explanation of how that works out, meanings work out. The first meaning envoy doesn't need the explanation. An envoy was sent, to declare God's after you. Okay? As long as you're going to get yours. Okay? So that's pretty clear, the envoy idea. It doesn't need any explanation. The hinge or pivot does reflect a change in the status quo in verses 5 to 8. Talk about the national changes for the portions of Edom. Very clear how that, and they're just confused. How did this happen? How could this happen to us? And there's this change that took place because of their attitudes and actions. And the third meaning of pain is certainly involved in the latter part when it talks about their ultimate pain, complete and total annihilation as a people in the latter part of the chapter. Okay? So it's all there. Okay? And that first, that one word right at the very beginning, in that one word, capsulizes where this is going. Matter of fact, it's quite an amazing book, that book of Obadiah. It's only one chapter, because as you flow through the book, you've got the decline of Edom all the way through to the absolute ultimate end, when they're completely, totally annihilated with no survivors at the end. Okay. But on the same token, as you work through the book, you find the devastated and beat up Israelites or Judeans here, and it comes up to its absolute ultimate peak of glory with the Messiah reigning over the kingdoms of the earth here with it as Israel, right? In Israel. And so it really is an amazing book if you look at the whole thing, look at through. Anyway, part of that is, of course, this figures and language that goes on there. Okay? Now there's a lot more we could say about figures and language. We see anything in Psalm number 1 that could be classified as figures?
Yes.
Yeah, we did. Let's look at Psalm 1 more time here. I'm trying to get to it. Let's see here. Let's look at the Psalm. Actually, I probably should just, that's okay. I probably should just look at the text. I didn't put the whole text in there, Look at our Bible, actually, when we do it this way. We just clean the text up. Okay. Load it up. Then we'll look at it and see if we can discover figurative stuff here. Okay? Okay, here's an example big. Easy to read though. Okay, blessednesses of the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or in the counsel of sinners, or in the way of sinners, does not stand, or in the seat of scorners he does not sit. Is there anything in that first verse you would say, gee, that sounds like it could be potentially a figurative expression or something? Anything there?
There's a certain amount of parallelism between the list of things.
Yeah, that's
sitting, standing.
Okay, all right. Just the whole concept of walking, standing, sitting, right? I mean, there's a movement there, to be sure. Okay, is there anything else there?
Concept of when I think of walking, somewhere. I don't want to think of walking in vice.
Okay. So walking in itself is used in a metaphorical way, meaning something other than literally one step in front of the other.
And the same with standing.
And you have something from the standpoint of the way in which the words are ordered here, right? How would you typically say it in a prose fashion? Well, you wouldn't even have it this way. You would say the man is blessed, The man, which man? Well, who doesn't walk in the counsel of the godly, and then we would say, and who doesn't stand. And that's where we would put it. We follow the same pattern. Doesn't stand, in the way of sinners, and when we put the verb front, and he doesn't sit and see the scorners. We make that all parallel and, in a fashion, but here it's not. Okay? Is there anything to be said about, and that's the question we simply ask here, but we recognize first off, there is a rearrangement of the order here, of the clauses, and is there anything significant about that? Okay? Right? And in fact, what we could do is we would look at Bullinger and find out about that section that talks about arrangement of words and see, is there anything significant here that could be classified as a figure? Okay? And we won't do that right now. But that's what you could do. So you could recognize. So you recognize that as different than strict prose, right? Okay. Is there anything in verse 2 that you could classify as symbolic? But in the law of Yahweh is his delight, and in his law he meditates, mutters, talks to himself day and night. Anything there?
Is the day and night concept figure speech?
Okay, well, there's an issue with day and night. Okay, day and night. There is a form of figure that involves two extremes. Okay? Heaven and earth being extreme, day and night being extreme, right? And what that figure word does is you're dealing with two extremes. But in dealing with two extremes, you include everything in the middle, right? So day and night doesn't mean when the sun came up, he meditates, and when it went down, he stopped meditating, and he does a lot of other things too. No, what this says is he's always right? But there's something even more obvious, and we did that when we were doing our diagram. It became obvious here. We just didn't associate it with a figurative expression. There's an ellipsis here. There's no verb in this clause. Okay? There's no verb there. But in the law of Yahweh is delight. Wait a minute. Something's missing here. Okay, ellipsis. Why is it there? To make us think about what goes there? No, to make us not think about what goes there. It should be relatively easy to insert something, but to focus attention on what is there. Okay. And not only that, typically, where would the prepositional phrases be in a prose statement? Prose statement would be, his delight is in the law of the Lord. That's like the way the English reads it. Why can't they be like English? Because they're Hebrews. No. What's fronted, this section right here, is where the strongest emphasis is, isn't it? The focal point. In the law of Yahweh is his delight. And notice here's the verb, right? Here's the verb here, but here's then the prepositional phrase. And in his law, right? There's the focal point here. Okay? Right? So it's got to do with word order. It's got to do with what's put in front. It varies from the norm from the standpoint of normal prose writing. Okay? So there's that. Okay. There's something else that's potential here. We'll get to poetry later on. But in the concept of parallel thoughts, okay, parallelism. There's two sections of this line. Two lines here. Or two sections, two parts of this line. Here's the first one, but in the law of Yahweh is his delight. There's that one part. And this is the second part, this other part, right? And there's a relationship between the two parts of the line. His delight is now transferred into, the concept there is transferred into this activity of his thinking and muttering, if you will. Okay? And doing it continually. There's another figure of expression. See? So there's at least three things there can be noted there from the right point of view. And he would be like a tree which has been planted by the water courses, which its fruit it produces in its time, and its leaf doesn't wither, leaves, and everything he does prospers. Okay, so is anything of an expressive of nature, figurative expression would come forth there? Well, sure. I mean, like a tree. I mean, the person is like a tree. Okay, so there's a simile, right? What's a simile designed to do? Compare. Okay, is it trying to compare every little aspect? Where's the bark? Let's talk about the bark of the guy. No, we're not emphasizing the bark here. We're comparing it, but in specific ways. There's certain things, right? What if we didn't say, what if cough was not there, and we said, and a man is a tree planted by the water course? What would that be? Huh?
Metaphor.
That would be a metaphor. Not a comparison, which is also a comparison, right? But you're comparing a little differently than a simile, right? You're comparing in a little more dramatic way than a simile. So a little more detailed. Okay, so we've got this person here who is like a tree, just been planted by a water course. Okay, so we're designing this figure, this imagery. Now we're supposed to think of a tree planted. What does that mean? Well, that is going to result in this leaf not withering and all the thing and the fruit production for the second part of this verse, right? So that's where the parallelisms come into play. Okay. Notice the second part here. It's got its fruit. It produces its fruit in its time, at its right time. Well, the fruit is emphasized. It's out of its order. A natural prose order. You would put the verb first, not the object, right? You would put the verb first, not the object. Well, here's the object they pulled up as a focal point. Okay? So a focal point here on fruit, and a focal point over in the next clause on what? On leaf. On its leaves, right? Which is the fruit and the leaves are both products of the tree which has been planted by the water and its nourishment and produces, right? Okay. And then all of that is tied into this last clause. Now we're back. We started with he. Now we're back to he, third person singular, right? Master. So we started with a person, who's this guy who meditates a lot, and then we went into a simile, okay, with an imagery, and then we're back to the person again. Okay? That is a change, if you will, in application of words here. Okay, so we started with the man, went into a simile, now we're back to the man to get the conclusion in that section. And everything that he does prospers, if he prospers. Okay. Now, verse 4, anything there? Literally, not so the wicked. Anything there?
Order.
Okay, but more importantly, does that make sense? Not so the wicked. Ellipsis. There's an ellipsis here, okay? The wicked are not like this, we would say if we were to. This is not the experience of the wicked, we would say if we were writing prose, right? Okay, so there's an ellipsis for what purpose? To focus upon what? Initially the contrast. Not so, as far as the wicked is concerned. Okay? But, and here's the contrast. So not so, but like chaff. Well, that sounds like a simile. Yeah, right. And then that's going to be expanded a little bit, right? Well, what's the deal with chaff? Well, the wind drives it away. Right? And that's in a normal order there. Okay. So the issue there would be, as in the normal order in a sentence, the verb would be the primary word, term, in Hebrew, of course.
Would it be relevant to make a connection between the chaff and the tree?
Yeah, oh, yeah, definitely. There is a connection between these two. Well, like a tree. This person is like a tree. This person is like chaff.
So one's kind of alive and one's...
Yeah, right. And then the other is just kind of floating through the world with any wind that comes by. And he's dead. Literally, right? He's been cut off. There's no nourishment. Chaff is something that's been cut off from its roots, right? So there's a relationship in that direction as well. Figuratively. The figures themselves are bouncing off one another. So verse 3 is bouncing for verse 4, and verse 3 are contrasted and bouncing off one another as well. Okay. Verse 5. Anything there? Therefore, the wicked will not rise to establish in the judgment of the seat of justice. Sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Did you see any there that would say maybe I ought to check bones?
There seems to be some parallelism with the wicked and sinners.
There is. There's certainly that. There's the wicked here. There's the sinners here. There's the righteous here. Okay? Right? There's also an ellipsis, isn't there? An ellipsis in this case is a what? The verb. This verb is doing double duty. It's understood in the next clause. Okay? And the reason why then it would be elliptical, that is not there, is because they don't want you so much to focus on this business of rising or being established, okay, as the context in which they are going to be not rising or established, as in the congregation of the righteous. They're not going to be there, right? 6, verse 6. The godly knows the way of righteous people, or the man of life perhaps, and the man of life of wicked people perishes. Anything there? Could be classified in a figurative way. What do you see here?
Only parallelism between the righteous and the wicked.
Okay.
And it reflects back up to the other verses about how the chaff is driven out and how the wicked don't stand, and here they perish altogether.
The conclusion in this instance, yeah. Okay. You see some other things that occur, for instance, the way of the righteous, and then this new clause begins with the way of the wicked. So those two are pulled together to contrast themselves right in the center there. You can't hardly avoid that. So you follow normal word order. And so what we have here is verbal idea here, and at the beginning, and verbal idea at the end, and then in the middle where the contrast is drawn. Right? So that's a rhetorical type development. So, there's an example of things that when we did our work initially, we may have in fact not even thought in those kinds of terms, but they're all over the place, right? And if we don't stop and think about those, then we're missing out on a lot of the communication. See, all that got to do with communication, doesn't it? And that then is where you draw applications from those concepts that are there. If we just read it without thinking in terms of those, then we may have a good message, but we're going to miss the main impact of the thing. Okay, because poetry is designed to impact, and these figurative languages are designed for impact. Okay? So there's an awful lot in figurative language that you need to keep aware of. Remember, I remind you just one more time. About 50% of the Old Testament is written in poetry, which means that this kind of stuff should be expected. Okay? Not surprised when you find it, but expected. So when you bump into poetry, you should expect to see that maybe a little more difficult to translate because the word order isn't going to be, normal, as you would say. Okay? And there's reasons for it, and there's things that we should recognize because of it, as part of interpretation of the passage. And that's about 50% of the Old Testament. See how much fun this is?
Is it possible also to run into figurative language and rhetoric in just the prose passages?
Embedded within prose. Yeah, yes, there is. Yes, there is. Sometimes for the purpose of just enhancing a focal point on something, if that will occur. Okay.
Especially the rhetorical things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. That's right. More rhetorical things in the strict prose stuff than you would find it as the imagery type things, or simile, metaphor, complicated stuff like that, but more rhetorical than that. Yes. Okay. But then again, don't miss out on the fact that you could easily find word plays within narratives, if you will. Okay. In fact, if I remember right, he used an illustration when he's talking wordplay. It wasn't all from poetry, I don't think, in his illustration. Let's see.
Page 31.
Humpty Dumpty. Let's see. I'm looking for his illustrations, and he's got this wordplay specifically. Let's see. Words at play. Word repetition. Okay, so in word repetition, 1 Samuel 18 is talking about the word love using repetition, right? That's a narrative, 1 Samuel 18. We're talking about then repetition, for example, in relationship to 2 Kings 1, the next page. Or he's using it, 2 Samuel 11, he's using the word seven, he says 7 times involved there, repetition. Or sound play, of course he references Amos, which is poetic, and Isaiah, which is poetic, but there's more, obviously, there's more than there as well. Double entendre, he's got one in Jonah, that's a prose section, the only poetry in Jonah is chapter 2, okay? And etc. So, it's all over, okay? You'd be more aware of in poetry, obviously, but it's all there. Okay. We're going to take a break and go on. Alright, so far I just want to look at this right to begin with here. What we've done so far. We look at reading the text, which again is, as far as I'm concerned, the most important skill you can develop. Exegete, go ahead and read it. And then develop the context within which to interpret it. Historical studies of various kinds, broad for the whole book or the area, but also narrow. Okay, now when you come to the middle of books, what you're at here for your term paper, so to speak, you want to put the whole, you want to try to get the historical context. So you're not talking about, putting Moses in the intertestamental period as far as world history is concerned. Okay? But also the internal stuff. If you did Exodus, for instance, you would want to track down the Amalekites and see what's the issue there. If you do, what are you going to do? You're going to do the...
I'll do the King's Man.
Yeah, so the King's Man. So you need to do some study that relates to that business of Elisha. Who was he? What time frame was he in? What's going on in the world? Why is he stuck out there? And who are these sons of the prophets? I didn't know he was married. Whatever questions arise in your mind. There's that. There's perhaps even the level of what they were trying to do out there in the wilderness, building. Why would they be doing that? Why are they living out there? there's various kinds of historical things that could come up in more narrower in all of them. Term analysis, you want to be able to do your work. Again, you don't have to. Let me just think in terms of the paper for a second. Reading the text, there wouldn't be anything in the paper that would reflect. Have you read the text? I mean, I can figure that out if you haven't read the text by the other stuff that you do. Historical studies, you're going to want to put that in no matter what, some aspects of the historical study there. Term analysis, you're not going to do what we did in Psalm and have the whole thing listed and figure out 10 pages and that's it, 10 pages of that. You'll want to do it, but what you're doing is you're determining in the process where the significant key issues are, right? Interpretive aspects that need to be developed in some way or another, and then you're going to extract those and they will get inserted, as you develop the focus of the story. Diagramming, that would go along with it. Textual criticism, if there's anything of nature there that would change the text, particularly, you don't have to say anything about there's 17 textual problems, none of them mean anything, and let me describe them all for you, right? That isn't what we want. If you change the text, right, then you tell me why you changed it. Okay. Word studies, each one of those passages could have significant places where you would want to develop maybe a particular word or two, maybe some parallels, I would think. Figurative language, we'll find out if you find anything in there about figurative nature. Actually, of course, your commentaries, you might want to quote somebody who concluded something, agreed with you, therefore you thought you quoted. Of course, application, I like to see application too. Now, there's another dimension to it. These are stories, these are narratives, so we haven't got there yet. You might want to read ahead if you want to start anything. Read ahead in the books, code books, to see what's involved in narrative. We'll talk more about that next time. So how you develop narrative. And that would be part of it. But anyway, we've done these things so far. We need to do exegetical questioning, commentaries, won't have to spend much time there, and some applications. Okay? And then becomes the more broader genre-specific things, which we may or may not. We may just wait for this stuff until next time. So, we don't get everything all at once here. It's hard enough to do it in 2 sessions without having to do everything in 2 sessions. In 1 session. So let me go back down to this exegetical questioning and work through this and work through a problem or two to find out what the issue is here. We've already done some of this. Those who didn't know it. We had that section when I had this discovery up here on this guy. No, Exodus. The Exodus passage in chapter 7 where I had the reservoir words. I asked a question in that one. I said, well, there's something that bothers me about this passage, right? And that's where it got started. You see, something that wasn't clear. It seemed to be pretty straightforward, but something lurked in the background. Wasn't sure what it was. It turned out to be that word issue. The application of that word. Okay? Here, you could ask the same thing. Working through Proverbs 14 here, you could have said, what could have come up when after you translated it? What an interesting passage. But, okay, that's what happens. So exegetical questioning. We'll talk about more about it in our terms with Daniel, who's got a little quote in there. But This particular book is pretty good on that score of exegetical questioning. In fact, the quotation I'll take right now says, of course, interpreters understand text only by asking questions and receiving answers. It's true. Asking the right questions is of crucial importance. For asking the wrong questions will undoubtedly result in receiving wrong answers. So one of the weighty issues in hermeneutics is to know how to ask the right questions. Right? And of course, if you don't ask any questions, it means you're not thinking it through. So that's a pretty good quotation. But what we're trying to do is to either determine the answers to problems, issues, interpretive issues, or validate. You may already have a conclusion, you need to validate. So, Gordanius is pretty good, but still a very valid and useful interpretive book on this business of validation is Hirsch's book. Thick, pretty good book on validating. Now, Ruby, I'm using him as a guide to logical thinking. I'm using that because he gives us a good, easy to work format in tracking down some of this business. So you'll see it again. I'm using some notes. Okay. So notice, say, exegetical question. You need to ask the questions. Well, give me a list of questions so I can ask them, and then that just doesn't work, okay? You can always do the what, why, like the reporter's concept, the what, the where's, the why's, the how's, and then you got all your questions there, and that's the whole basis of their work, practically, right? Well, it's not quite so simple in what we're talking about here, okay? And each passage kind of raises its own questions. If you're thinking through the passage, it raises its own questions. Sometimes the questions Sometimes the questions can be pretty obvious as to the source of the problem. Other times it can be pretty vague, and you got to work a little bit just to get at the right question. Okay. Something bugs me about this passage, and I don't know what it is. Okay. Now you can try a series of things, but here's how it generally works. We pretty much know, or we can get a feel for the process of exegesis, as what's involved in exegetical method. Okay. We could ask questions if we're trying to work on what is it that's here, but I don't know exactly how to put my finger on it. We can ask questions that touch upon various aspects of our exegetical process. Right? Is it a textual problem? Is it a word study issue? Do I understand all these words? Right? Is there a word that I understand, or I think I understand, I'm not sure. Is that my area of my difficulty? Is it the syntax issue related to other words? Is it the fact that there might be it doesn't flow very well? Is there a figurative issue involved here? In other words, you could go through that kind of a process to try to come up with the area in which to ask the question, and therefore work through for an answer to the question and hopefully solve the problem. Okay? But there's no real list that you can really get. Okay? So these are the lists, go through the list, you'll come up to the right question. Okay? That's not how it works. Okay. Now here's the real thing. You sense that nebulous, what's nebulous mean?
Can't grab.
You're trying to get a hold on this thing and it just kind of can't grab it. It's just like unsure feeling about a passage. Student seeks to define, and you want to define the nature of the problem. Is it an ambiguous word, a historical allusion, a grammatical anomaly? A number of things can be the cause for this thing. Sometimes, here's from a student perspective, let me put it in another sense, way in which you might have an unsure feeling about this passage. Okay, I'm going to exegete this passage, and it's a term paper, and I'm going to submit to the professor. He knows more about it than I do, or at least he thinks he does, or I think he does, And he might see some things or expect me to do things, and I'm not sure that I know everything I need to do. Right? So the uncertainty may not be so much from the text, maybe in you. Okay? Right? Don't worry too much about that. Okay? Okay? If you don't do something that needed to be done and was not obvious, for instance, if there was a textual problem and it was obvious that a whole lot of manuscripts disagreed, and you decided that, and the text needed to be changed because, let's say, you can't even pronounce it the way it is, and you didn't do anything about it, I would say, red pencil time. Wrong, just get with it, you didn't do that. But if there's another thing, let's say it was something that I became aware of a rhetorical nature, let's say, which can be kind of vague for somebody especially who's not real familiar with this stuff. You say, gee, that really is an important issue. I see that there, but the student didn't come up with it. Okay. Well, the student necessarily may not have been expected to come up with it, given the nature of the issue. You know what I'm saying? So that's not the point. Okay, that's not the point. We're not looking at trap anybody here. Okay. So don't worry about what does he want. Concern yourself about, I know the process, and I'm going to try to work it out in this text, and I hopefully I'll come up with everything I need to get a good, solid interpretation of this. Right? Comfortable. It'll work for you, I'm sure. Just don't worry about your own insecurities, which, you see, this whole business we said right at the very beginning involves art to some degree, that is, no facts and no things, no tools, and no how to use them and stuff. That there's a skill part to it. And that sometimes is how or when to use something, or how to integrate something. That's a skill development. And that takes time and effort, and you're not necessarily going to all be perfect exegetes when the course is over. Right? Okay. So don't concern yourself about don't get hung up on your own insecurities. Make sure you're insecure that's the text that's making you insecure. Okay, so here's the 8 steps in the scientific method which can help you find the right questions and get to the right answers. Okay? I'm using Ruby for this. Okay, and we're going to illustrate it after I walk through his system. Okay? His words are in the italics here. The situation which generates the inquiry. In our case, something uneasy about this text. I'm not sure I got everything down well here. Right? Okay. We'll illustrate it and then we'll walk through each of these processes. Precise formulation of the problem. Precise formulation. Critical issue. Okay? If you, as Gradania said, if you ask the wrong questions, you're going to get to the wrong street. You're going to get the wrong answers or no answers, right? You want to make sure you got the right questions, you got the right problem. Okay? You don't want to say, I need to do a word study when the issue was really a syntax study. You see? So you conclude a word study and you think that's going to solve the problem when it's really the wrong question, the wrong area. So time spent doing this will be very significant. Okay, it's a key actually. Observation of the relevant facts. Okay? All the facts that you discover may not in fact be relevant to your problem. Okay? I had a good illustration of this when I was doing my dissertation. I was doing my dissertation in 1 Corinthians 15. And I eschatological aspects of 1 Corinthians 15, the end time stuff. And right in the middle of that chapter, between the two eschatological sections, is this whole business about, the first Adam, the second Adam, first one from the earth, and the second one from heaven, and all the nature of the body, and the resurrected body, and all of that. And I was working on some problems within that whole section, trying to figure out, understand all of that, and there was all kinds of arguments, all kinds of viewpoints. And I was working through all the viewpoints. And I was getting frustrated that I wasn't getting anywhere. Then I backed off one point. So that after only a week or more working on it, I backed off at one point and I said, okay, here's my viewpoints. Here are the viewpoints. If I went for viewpoint number 1, how does that affect my problem? Right? And I went through all the viewpoints and I concluded it doesn't make any difference on where my dissertation is related to. It's an interesting problem and a good set of problems that make a nice dissertation, but it's not relevant to my dissertation. So all I needed to do was, after working on it a week or more, realizing all I need to do is footnote the problems that are here, indicate how they affect or not affect my passage or my problem, my area, and then just move on. I didn't even need to spend all that time doing that. In other words, there was all kinds of relevant facts I was gathering and working on that turned out to be not relevant to my problem. Okay, right? So sometimes the stuff that you dig out will not be relevant. And therefore, don't get hung up on it. This happens a lot when students, maybe this will come up in your homiletics class, I don't know. When, the student goes through the exegesis of everything, and then he feels like he's got all this information on this passage, and he's got the passion to give it all to people, But the problem is that if he's focusing his sermon on, let's say, a particular theme or something, and he's going to give all the facts of everything he learned, well, half of those are not going to be related to the theme. Okay? And so you want to make sure you sift things properly, and you sift out those facts that are not going to be relevant to the theme. Okay? Well, the same occurs here. Okay? So be careful to do that. Discover the facts that are relevant and critical to what you're looking for. Don't just go for hunting every single fact at that point and try to use it all. Use the previous knowledge. Here's where we talked about before. See, I might look into your passage and I might see some things that come to my mind, and I might see things that you never saw. I say, what are they, blind? What's the problem here? Well, no, the problem is I've only been working on this for 30-some years. I've been doing this, and he or she hasn't been doing this for 30 years. Maybe they haven't done it for a year. Their reservoir of knowledge hasn't been built up yet. You're right. And so sometimes, though, we do have that previous knowledge that we bring to the process. Okay, and that's important. You will have some too, for instance. For instance, just a simple thing. Oh, it's a syntax issue that I'm working on. Your knowledge says, well, I have a book that gives me the syntax, breakdowns that I need, and my previous knowledge of Hebrew says this happens to be an accusative case, so I know that my previous knowledge is an accusative, and I know it's a syntax issue, and I know that Troy, or whatever his name is there, has got all the breakdown for me, and I can solve my problem. Right? That's previous knowledge. Okay. Or it might be, I'm working on the Amalekites, you might know who they are from previous study. You see, previous knowledge. Formulation of the explanatory hypothesis. A guess, in other words, your hypothesis, being a theory as to what the conclusion is going to be. So you make a preliminary interpretation. Right? Means such and such, just my conclusion. Then deductions from that. hypothesis. If the hypothesis is true, this is from Louis now. If the hypothesis is true, then certain consequences can be predicted. Okay? Working out of the implications of the hypothesis tells us what facts will verify or confirm the hypothesis. Okay? So you look at your conclusion and say, if this is the truth here, this is the conclusion, what does that imply? Because in fact, a valid implication can't, or put it this way, a true interpretation, a proper interpretation which cannot elicit invalid implications. See what I'm saying? That's not going to work. Implication is wrong. Interpretation is probably skewed somewhere along the line. Okay? So you back off from any of that and you ask and say, okay, what are the implications of what this says? See? Okay. So then you inquire into the text further. It takes you further, in a sense, doesn't it? To track down what the implications are of this theory that you've got. And then you test it by further observation or experiment, or in this case, what it would be is we look at it from the standpoint of have I checked the theology of this? Is this my conclusion? Does that fit the theological structure of the Hebrew mind? Right? Or does it fit the historical scenario? Right? For instance, just take a wild statement. What if your conclusion, without looking into it further, was that the sons of the prophets were the children of Elijah? Right? Okay, so that takes you to, well, then he must have a wife, and he must have had some kids, and he must, well, you could start trying to track some of that down, and the reality is you're not going to track any of that down. Historically, it's not going to fit. You have to wipe that theory out, right? Mm-hmm. You have to go somewhere else. So it could be historical, grammatical, theological, or it could be a grammatical issue that comes up, and you make a stab at maybe this is a certain kind of a idea in this verbal system here. You say, gee, that would be really nice. It would work out really well, and you check your syntax books, and you can't find a category that's going to meet it, right? Well, then you do one of two things. You type in a new category, or you back off and say, gee, maybe I better rethink it, right? Don't type in too many new categories. Okay. So then the conclusion is you either confirm or don't confirm the hypothesis. Okay. Now, there's, of course, another section that we could go beyond after you get to that point. And that is you could go through commentaries and see what they've done with this thing. Okay? And sometimes you would do that even in the process of working through this other stuff. For instance, the previous knowledge. We don't all have all knowledge. So maybe at some point I want to see, maybe I missed something historically here or whatever. So you go to a commentary and see if they're going to add some data that of their previous knowledge that you don't have that could help you with that. To add to your knowledge base. Okay. Here's Hirsch is what he says on criteria. I think this is an important statement as well. To establish a reading, what he means by that is interpretation, as probable, it is first necessary to show, with reference to the norms of the language, that it's possible. For example, if you said this is a certain kind of accusative idea, but there is no, if you say this sounds like it should be an accusative indirect object, there is no category for accusative as indirect object, you see. So it's not possible, so that's not going to fit the initial statement. This is a criterion of legitimacy. The reading must be permissible within the public norms, so that is the common norms of the use of the language in which it was composed. I mean, if you can't find it in a grammar, don't push it. Right? Second criterion is correspondence. The reading must account for each linguistic component in the text. Okay? If you would begin to ignore, I can't quite understand this. This works. This would work great if this adverb wasn't in the text. Is there a textual problem where I can legitimately eliminate it? No? Well, shoot. You've got to relate to all the data. You just can't ignore some data, right? So you don't want to arbitrarily ignore some linguistic components or inadequately account for them. The reading may be assumed improbable if you can't account for everything that's there. Okay? You've got to account for it all. So that's the second criteria, is correspondence. And the third is that of generic appropriateness. If the text follows the conventions of a scientific essay, it's inappropriate to construe the kind of lucid meaning found in casual conversation. Or put it another way, look, if generic appropriateness, if in fact you're in a prose section and you're applying, let's say, a narrative, right, and you're applying the principles that you would use for prophetic literature, it's not appropriate to the genre, right? Or if you were applying narrative principles to the poetic literature, that's not in the right genre, you see? So it's got to be generically appropriate, okay? So he says, when these three preliminary criteria have been satisfied, there remains a fourth criterion which gives significance to all the rest, the criterion of plausibility or coherence. You've got to fit, bottom line. Three preliminary norms usually permit several possibilities of interpretation. And this is by definition the case when the text is problematic. In fact, you wouldn't have a problem if there wasn't no difference in interpretation. Faced with the alternatives, the interpreter chooses a reading which best meets the criterion of coherence. Okay? What does that mean? Well, you use all the data, and putting everything together makes sense. Right? That's what he says. Look, even when the text is not problematical, coherence remains the decisive criterion. Since the meaning is obvious only because it makes sense. It's the only way you can make sense is to utilize data that's not there. And that happens a lot. Okay? Or in translations. It occurs a lot in translations. Okay? Or, if the only way your interpretation can make sense is by not using some data that's there, then the probability's already got the wrong interpretation. Okay? It doesn't cohere, it doesn't hold together. Let me put it another way on the translation thing that I mentioned. The interpretations and translations of a particular text, those translations which add words to the text to make the translation smooth or work. Okay. There are some that add, for instance, the New American Standard, at least will put it in italics if they've added some words, right? NIV decided you don't need to know what we're adding, so they didn't do it. I guess that's why they decided that way. But anyway, the bottom line is they add words to the text, right? The issue is this. If the text can be understood without adding something to it to make it understandable, okay, then that has greater probability of being the correct reading than the one where you have to add words. Or use a logical concept of Occam's razor. You know what Occam's razor is?
Mm-hmm.
What?
The simplest is usually the correct.
Or that theory, which requires the least amount of hypotheses to work, is most probably the right one. You see what I'm saying, right? Mm-hmm. So if you've got to do three things to the text to make your interpretation work, you've got to reword it, I've got to add some words or take out some words or restructure it to make it work, okay? Okay? And another interpretation says all I have to do is restructure the sentence to make it work. Well, the one is better than the other, most probably. Okay? So that is certainly the thing that we kind of need to focus our attention on. And keep that in mind when you come across translations where you see all kinds of inserted words. I was going to use illustration. I won't use it as illustration, but just read the Message sometime and find out if they add anything to this verse. Gee, there's only 5 words in my Hebrew language verse, and there's 27 words in the Message verse. They must have added something here. Why did they have to add all those words? Well, because they didn't say what they wanted to say, and they just ignored what God had to say. That's my biased opinion. Please keep that in mind as you listen to this tape.
You represent your own personal...
That's all my personal biased viewpoint. That's right. Okay, so once the student has defined and answered the problem, possibly your insecurity about the passage will disappear, and you'll say, this is great, I'm going to go preach it. Okay? Change the world with my little message. Sometimes you can't quite get to that point. Conviction is not there. You're still wondering if you got it all. Right? So at this point, exegetical honesty takes over. Don't preach what you don't know. Okay? Okay? The preacher or teacher will not preach or teach what you don't know. That is out of ignorance. Or, as some homiletics professors used to say, if you got a weak point in your outline, bang on the table. Okay. There's going to be a lot that you don't know. But there's much more that you can know and can preach with convictions. Okay, so we're going to illustrate with all these situations with a statement from Micah here. Okay? And I forgot what my hyperlink this time is. Oh, it's Micah here. Micah 3:4. I won't go into the whole thing right now because we're going to walk through this process. But here's Micah 3:4. I think I mentioned this earlier on, but here it is again. And they will cry out to the Lord, but He will not answer them. Instead, He will hide His face from them at that time because they have practiced evil deeds. Understood or not, what should we say? It sounds like on the surface that repentance isn't working. There's no plan for repentance there. Now, let's look at this. Here's the Hebrew text here. The situation, we're following Ruby's outline here now. Walk through this. The situation which generates the inquiry. Is there no room for repentance? They pray, God ignored them. Okay? That's kind of depressing. Okay? I would like to think that if I repent and pray, God will hear me. But, that's a problem here. Okay? So we want to precisely formulate the problem. Okay? The reading of the text seems to contradict other scriptures, such as Judges, where God responds to the cries of His people, even when they have done wrong knowingly. Look, okay, before the teacher gets Okay, so in other words, already I'm plugging in previous knowledge, aren't I? I mean, I seem to hear before in Scripture, to see that when people actually repented and prayed, God heard them and responded. And here in Judges, they did it every week. They were doing it almost, Actually, it's much more than every decade. Observe the relevant facts. What are the facts in Micah's passage? The text is poetic. Okay. The verbs are future imperfect. That's how they read. Future imperfect, future imperfect, future perfect. That is all the various verbs here. Okay. In other words, that was how the syntax seemed to work itself out. Syntax of a perfect aspect is an open question. Okay. The conjunction ka-asher may hold the key, which is this word right here. Okay. That could hold the key because it seems to come down to the problem. That seemed to be the problem that I raised initially. Because they sinned, even though they repented, God didn't listen. Okay, so use of previous knowledge. The conjunction ka-asher can be understood as using a causal clause or a temporal clause. How did I know that? Well, it may not just simply been previous knowledge. It may have been awareness that maybe there's more syntactical options for that. So you look it up. That's what that's how it works. So you go to BDB, you look it up, or you look in your syntax book to see what the options are. And yes, causal, or temporal. Okay. Conjunction ka-asher can be used with the perfect aspect in either situation. So that's not apparently the issue. Okay. In other words, you could only use the perfect when it was causal, or only use it when it was, in temporal. The perfect aspect. That would have helped, right? But it can be used in either sense. We see that. How do we see? Well, we go to those places in BDB where they list the causal and see what the syntax looks like and what verbs they're using with that, what aspect, and then find out that it could be used. Okay, so I got some new facts there. Okay, 2 lines have 4 clauses that appear to be chiastic in development. Now there's previous knowledge of what? Concept of chiasmus or figurative language. Okay. 4 clauses appear to be chiastic in development. This would mean that I have to look at it and see if I put it in now. Then I have to look at it as A, B, B, A pattern. 4 clauses, right? And it seemed to work in that set word. They cried out to the Lord. He did not respond to them. He hid his face from them because they, see that word? Even in the pronouns. They, he, they. The 2 are responding. The middle ones are he, and outside ones are they. So it seems to work that way. Okay. 1b clearly responds in sense to 2a. That he, the line 1b and 2a have Yahweh as a subject. Okay. That's a mistake, I guess. And lines 1a and 2b have the people as the subject. Right? If genuinely chiastic, then 1a and 2b correspond to each other. Right? Okay. So there's previous knowledge kind of working that whole thing through there. See the effect of it. Formulation of an explanatory hypothesis. Okay, so the reason why God, this isn't, a theory now at this stage. The reason why God turns his back on his seemingly repentant people is because they will not stop their evil deeds. Would that, okay, there will be no genuine repentance. 30 aspects taken as knowing, so they have to go back to the 30. Okay, and introduced by temporal, ka-asher, when, as opposed to because. The resulting translation and the resolution of the reading of the text problem is they will cry out to the Lord while they keep doing evil with respect to their deeds. Right? Okay? So that's a theory. That's all it is at this point. Just a theory. Now the implications of that, you've got to draw that out. Okay? If that's true, what does that imply? Right? Well, number one, it would imply reply, God won't listen to somebody who is hypocritical in their praying. That is, they're sorry for what they did, but they're going to keep doing what they're doing. Right? Will that work out? In other words, is that an implication that seems to be true in the Scriptures? Well, here's a passage that seems to indicate that God won't respond to their prayers to continue in sin. If I regard witness my heart, the Lord isn't going to hear me. That seems to correlate with that. Right? So the theology of it seems to work. Isaiah 1:18 and 19 shows the opposite. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are as scarlet, they will be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they will be like wool. If you consent and obey, you will eat the best of the land. Opposite in the sense that, if they respond, he responds. So you test the hypothesis further. Numerous scriptures confirm the theological conclusion that genuine repentance opens God's ears to their prayers and continues rebellion closes them. Right? Now, if you can find a passage that denies that, in other words, if you can find a passage where there's genuine repentance and God decided he didn't want to listen to it, then that would be a problem still. Now we'd have to go back and rethink the whole thing. Right? Okay. So, this is a hypothesis then that could be confirmed. Right? Now, maybe there's other views as well. In other words, maybe the way in which I interpreted this passage based on this process, when I look at commentaries and whatnot, maybe they'll have a reason why it's still translated as because they have done evil in their hearts, right? Maybe they will have a theological explanation for making it work, making the passage work. All need to hear. But the question has to arise, and that is, I have to examine their process, not just their conclusion. Okay? What data did they utilize? Did they extract and use in their interpretation? Right? Did they ignore some facts of the text? Did they take the classic factor into account? And if they didn't agree with it, therefore didn't have that interpretation, did they, prove that it wasn't there? You know what I'm saying? Did they invalidate it? Okay. If they ignored it, then I could say, justifiably, I could say, well, I think I can justify that chiastic development there. I think I can justify that on numerous grounds. They ignored it or they didn't know about it. Okay? And therefore, I can invalidate their conclusion because they didn't use all the facts. At least they appear not to have used all the facts. See what I'm saying? Okay. Conversely, if I in fact went to a commentary and they did acknowledge the possibility, or at least the interpretation, that some people have taken this as chiastic and they were wrong and proved me wrong, okay, then I have to go back and rethink. Right? See what I'm saying? So, this pattern, this program that he's got, Ruby has got this 8-point system here, works out pretty good as far as getting us, I think, to the conclusions that we need to get to the right questions, answer the right questions, test the right questions, and come out with a solid interpretation that we can defend. Okay. Well, here is the passage I was going to work for. Why do I feel uneasy about this passage? That's the one in Exegesis right here. Well, we walk through the same process. Okay. You walk through this process and you could come away then with a solid conclusion. It's not just a guesswork, it's a solid conclusion about that. Okay? Any comments or questions further on this business of exegetical questioning? It's kind of fuzzy because there's no specific questions. They're kind of floating around in the text somewhere and in your mind and in your emotions or something, and you're just kind of wondering what's bugging me here. And why can't I be more emphatic in my conviction here? So, anything that comes to mind that you want to interact with, that's cool. He said, how long is this going to last? That's what he's saying. I'm tired. I need to go to sleep. I had too big of a lunch. Okay. Commentaries. I've got a couple of bibliography things on commentaries. Notice the kind of things they are. The bibliography for commentaries. In other words, books on books. Okay? And these are valuable books. I kind of collect them when I find them because I'm constantly being asked. Just not too long ago, somebody said, well, I'm working on a book was it Peter or something like that. He said, they're going to be teaching that in Sunday school, and since I'm I have a doctorate in theology area and New Testament or whatever else, they say, well, he must know everything. So he knows all the books that have ever been written. So he must know what's the best book on such and such a topic. Right? Well, I have books that tell me about books. That's what I know. Okay, so I have these books. And there's other books out there. But these books, for instance, Commentary Survey will give me, let's say Isaiah. They'll give a list of books on Isaiah, but they'll also annotate and tell me what the focus is on there and what the emphasis is, what kind of commentary it is, And some of these books will even give you a plus or minus kind of viewpoint, which is, not too good, or is this a liberal orientation, but good on history. This is a theological kind of a work, but it's evangelical or whatever. Okay. So books on books are good books to have in your library, because you can be asked a question. Okay. Or here's yourself. They're going to say, they asked me to teach the book of Revelation. Okay. I said no. So I need to get some good books on that, or I want them to have a copy of the Minor Prophets, because we're going to work through the Minor Prophets, and so they need to have something that I want them to read. So what am I going to get them to read? Right? Those are going to read. So those are helpful books. Common fallacies. Here's one fallacy. And people won't say this directly, but you will. Yeah, but I'll say it directly. But their activities and attitudes reflect that this seems to be where they're at. The sum total of commentaries expresses the sum total of biblical interpretations. Short, there's nothing new to be discovered, so why reinvent the wheel? Just go out and buy a bunch of commentaries, because the truth is in there somewhere. Look, there's a lot of people whose whole exegetical method is 5 commentaries, read all 5, make a decision on what, between them, and go preach.
That's bad, right?
Well, we'll see if that's bad. The problem is, this came out real easy again for me, that is real evident for me when I was working on my dissertation. One of the comments I had in my dissertation, one of the readers made a comment about, gee, they seem to be using old sources here for this section, right? You know what I'm saying? Somebody wrote a commentary back in the 30s or somebody in the 70s instead of the brand new stuff in the 90s, let's say. Well, it's not that I haven't read what was written in the 90s. But the point is that what was the person in the 90s did was just, I don't want to say plagiarizing, but taking the thinking processes of the guy who wrote them who came up with the idea in the 30s. And since no longer a copyright issue, he just decided this is my fault. You see, right? So for intellectual honesty, that's what I told my reader. And I said, look, honesty would say give credit for whose credit is due. You know, this guy in the 90s who wrote the commentary in 1995 didn't come up with that idea. He stole the idea from the guy who came up with it in 1930. And I want to give credit to where credit is due, but I accommodated him anyway in the sense of saying I'm going to put the original thinker first, but I'll include at the back end of my footnote that there's other guys who do this. But at any rate, a lot of old knowledge is being dragged down into the present, recycled, and the problem I have with it is that there's so little new thinking that is taking place. You see? I mean, I've got some commentaries, some books, let's say a book of the Old Testament, or New for that matter, but particularly one that I think was really obvious. The New Testament commentary, a small book, but on Philippians, you read the book and you can see exactly how what his process was. He had 5 other commentaries. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were sitting on his desk. I mean, I can visualize it. He's at his computer, and there they are, right? And he is working through the text, verse by verse, checking all 5, selecting one, typing it in. Going to the next verse, checking all 5, selecting the other one, typing it in. I mean, there was absolutely no original thinking going on whatsoever. That's why the commentary frankly wasn't as good as far as that's concerned, even though he was a named scholar. Okay? And there's another reason why that turns out problematic, and that's one of the reasons, frankly, why I produced my own book. And that is, it's a practical one where the book publisher says, our big push for new books is November. I think that is the day, October, November. A big push for new books is November. We've got to have your book out by November. Right? Well, that means I've got to compress my time frame to be able to get everything done within that time. In fact, if it's going to be out in November, that means I've got to have it initially to the publisher probably as early as June, because it's going to go back and forth with editing and all that stuff that goes on with it. So now I've got, maybe 2 months to get the thing written and done and put in. I don't have the time to think everything through and work what I think needs to be done. You see, right? And so sometimes the problem is that new books today are produced without much original thinking. I just have to say it bluntly. Okay? They're just poured out, and there's very little new thinking. Okay? So they won't, frankly, stand the test of time either. The only time-standing test that will be the original thought. Well, that's just one. There is new stuff to be found. Why is there new stuff to be found? Say everything's in commentaries. No, it's not. Why not? Why? Give me some examples why that's not true.
You want to go first? Archaeology.
We discovered something new. Dug in the ground, lo and behold, we got this stela there. Gave me a new word. Or a new relationship, a connection with the word, right? So I expand my lexicon, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Okay, archaeology. What else? Just the simple concept of methodology is always in process, right? Okay? The concept of how we go about it, methodology is in process. So, one methodology may be better than another, or more comprehensive than another, right? In which case, it's going to be able to elicit more data, facts. Look at something from a different way, you see.
Even as technology increases, it's easier to do, some of those syntactical studies.
That's right. Except I still wonder how in the world these buggers know that this, in the whole Old Testament, that this thing only occurred twice, and they didn't have a computer. I'd like to know how to do that. That's amazing to me, just amazing to me. Okay, so there's another problem. Here we go. Because commentators are learned men and women, they have grappled with all interpretive issues involved in the text. That's a non sequitur. And it is out there. People think that way. Because you've got a PhD, you certainly are able to have a better interpretation than me. Well, that's not necessarily true. Except on the term paper. Okay? That's not necessarily true at all. Okay? You can have, I think I may have illustrated before, you could have 2 people with PhDs or 7 PhDs. Exactly the same school, exactly the same intelligence quotient, right? Exactly the studying, exactly the same verse from exactly the same text, and coming up with opposite interpretations. How could that be? Right? It might be as simple as a matter of method. Right? One person with a method. Or you can have this. You can have a absolute Einstein-type individual with all the degrees. And then you can have a Bible college student struggling to get 1 degree, you see, right? And you can have the Bible college student coming up with a better interpretation than the Einstein. Why? Maybe he's following a better method. They've got better data, right? Or you can have, and this often occurs too, you can have one individual who doesn't really do well at the area of logic. In other words, following through with logical thinking and having non-sequitur thoughts and not recognizing it. Or, not being able to evaluate somebody else's non-sequitur thinking and therefore take their conclusion and add it to their ideas. You see what I mean? And somebody else has kind of been through enough logic, or at least has enough logic in there innately, where they do think through those things. You see? And so they're not going to get sidetracked. Okay? So just because they got degrees behind their name doesn't necessarily mean they got everything resolved. Okay? Please don't think I got everything resolved. Okay? Except in my book. Okay. Now, there's various kinds of commentaries. Okay? Critical, and there you may even add to the list, but critical, historical, theological, homiletical, and devotional. At least those 5. Okay? These are different types. In other words, they're different focuses. Okay? So, the critical commentary will focus what I got them laying down here. Critical commentaries look at the difference, intricacies of history, language, culture, etc. Okay? Right? If my problem is a linguistic one, and I'm going to go to a commentary, then I want a critical commentary. Okay? Right? Actually, if my problem here, this may shock you or be strange, sound strange to you, but if my problem is a historical one, I want to go to a liberal commentator, one who's theologically liberal. See, theological liberals really give great attention to historical issues. They're not. And the evangelical theologian or commentator is much more interested in getting the truth, theological truth out there, than they are in going into the really detailed historical backgrounds of stuff, only to the degree where they can get to this, not history, where they cannot begin to present their theology. Well, sometimes a liberal guy will present his theology too. That's easy to block out in your mind. But they will go through the historical data with a fine-tooth comb, right? And, so that's the kind of commentary I would look for if I was working on historical issues. Historical commentaries, that doesn't mean just dealing with history. They're really dealing with how the church or the Christians or the Jews, for that matter, have interpreted a passage down through the centuries. You see what I'm saying? And those are very good commentaries. On the New Testament side, Hendrickson tended to do that pretty well. Hendrickson series tended to do that pretty well. Morris tended to do that pretty good in some passages. What's his name now? Merrill Unger seems to do pretty good in the Old Testament. Of course, Cassuto, that is the Jewish interpreter, they followed through on some of the Jewish stuff. So those are helpful, to figure out how the people have interpreted the passage down through the years. And it'll keep you from doing a couple of things, from spending an awful lot of time just to learn what's been known for centuries, right? It's because somebody thought about this before. Oh, that's good to know. Why didn't it work? Why doesn't it work, or why does it work? And sometimes just simply to expand the possibilities of using your own self with that. So those are historical commentaries that are helpful. Theological commentaries. This is interesting. This is pretty good too, because sometimes we get so involved in the details of stuff, and we just kind of get involved in the trees, and not only the trees, but the roots of the trees, and not only the roots, what feeds the roots of the trees, to the point where we kind of lost sight of the whole forest here, right? And sometimes we need somebody to help us back off and say, okay, now, theologically speaking, this is where it goes, This is what works theologically, and this is what don't work theologically. You say, well, where I'm ending up isn't working theologically. I need to know that. Or how does the theology fit into this whole thing? So we'll go to a commentary who will deal with the theology of this stuff, you see. For instance, just as an example, what's the theological problems associated with an interpretation of Isaiah 7:14 that says this is a specific young marriageable age woman that we're talking about, not a virgin in the strict literal English use of the word sense. What's the theological ramifications? It's good to know. We don't want to come to a conclusion where theologically we're going to be, blackballed and become a heretic. From views out. Then there are homiletical commentaries. Not that they give you the sermon, obviously. Hopefully, you don't just extract their outline and say, this is a wonderful sermon that I found myself in a commentary, and then preach that. Okay? No. But they'll give you some sense of how a passage can be developed. Then you make it your own, but this is a way in which you can approach this passage. Actually, our book will do this at the end, up towards the end, when we've got literary forms in the hands of preachers and teachers. And let's see, here's the one. Oh, I was thinking of the Gregarious. Actually, our other book does some of that too. What's the name of that book? From Exegesis to Exposition. Okay? It'll kind of give you some feel for how to put some of this stuff into practice. Okay? So the homiletic commentaries, then there are devotional commentaries, the fluff that you wouldn't sniff at most of the time. Actually, that's not true, in my opinion. although that's the impression you sometimes get by the real scholars of the world. You wouldn't have anything to do with devotional commentary. Well, sometimes, frankly, you need a devotional commentary. Okay? You're getting so involved in the minutiae. You know, and you got to preach tomorrow, and you're still involved in trying to figure out the force of this body here. You know, and you just got to come up with, where does this go practically? I mean, you're so involved in non-practical things, so to speak, that, you know, where does this go? I mean, so you can read a devotional commentary that will not talk about the grammar or whatever. They don't know anything about that half the time, or more than half the time, but they